Today I want to talk a little bit about the Constitution. But first, what is a Constitution? A Constitution is what I like to call the rules about the rules. Constitutions answer the question, how shall rules be made in society? They often also state what substantive and procedural constraints there are on rulemaking. What's a substantive or a procedural constraint? Well, a procedural constraint, an example of which might be, how should the most important offices in the country be filled? Who elects whom? Who appoints whom? How does law become law? Procedural constraints articulate what procedures shall be used to make or challenge any given law. They set up a process for solving problems, settling disagreements, and ultimately deciding what to do. A substantive constraint, on the other hand, an example of which would be the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech, and so on and so forth. The Congress shall mint currency. Substantive constraints indicate not how things shall be done, but what shall be done. What goals will be pursued or not pursued by the government. The Constitution has some specifics about what different branches of governments shall and shall not do, and other directions that are much less clear about what shall and shall not be done. Other constitutions, including constitutions of U.S. states, are often far more specific than the U.S. federal Constitution about substantive constraints. They will impose more substantive constraints and will mandate that the government do more. Constitutions are sometimes thought to be an expression of society's basic fundamental commitments or priorities. In this sense, constitutions are also what you might call aspirational. Aspirational means what you aspire to. Many countries have elements in their constitution that guarantee things like basic health care or basic education for all, even though those societies and governments do not have the money to make those things happen, not for everyone, anyway. In that sense, their constitution aspires to providing these goods and says the government should try really hard. Constitutions are also sometimes referred to as fundamental law or basic law, and that's to separate them from more mundane, ordinary law. Now, the U.S. Constitution, though, is thought to be legally binding upon government, not just an ideal that government should imperfectly strive to live up to. So in that sense, the U.S. Constitution is not merely aspirational. Even though it does express ideals, the idea is not just that these are standards that we should try to achieve, but these are standards that government is in fact obligated to achieve. The U.S. Constitution is shorter and more restrained as far as the number of substantive commitments it commits the federal government to undertake, and that makes it easier not to be aspirational. Okay, how did the Constitution come about? Well, originally the United States was composed of 13 colonies, 13 British colonies, and collective action problems arose between the states. In particular, the states could not produce public goods that each of the states wanted, but none wanted to pay for by themselves. Things like national defense, or internal security, or free trade, or a unified currency. All of these were things that the governments of each of the separate states wanted, but did not want to shoulder the burden of providing on their own. The Articles of Confederation, which is a precursor to the U.S. Constitution, was the first attempt on the part of these 13 colonies at overcoming collective action. The Articles of Confederation had no chief executive, really, could not really enforce the agreements between the states. It relied on voluntary enforcement on part of each of the states. States could cheat, but there was no way to punish the states if they did cheat. And the decision-making process between the states was vulnerable to holdouts. That is to say, the Articles of Confederation required unanimity to amend, and That means everyone had to agree. And of course, if one person, one state did not agree, then nothing could get done. And that gave a lot of power to a very small minority. A state like, say, Rhode Island could hold up the entire process of legislation if it wanted to. They're under the Articles of Confederation. So, the Articles of Confederation, many people thought, were inconvenient and did not succeed in solving the collective action problems faced by the original 13 colonies. So, they formed a constitution. Now, as it turns out, they came together to try and put together a constitutional convention to improve on the Articles of Confederation. The irony is that it's not entirely clear that the Constitutional Convention itself was constitutional under the Articles of Confederation, but we'll let that slide for now. Forming a constitution, in fact, is a coordination problem. The states all agreed that they needed better rules to regulate them, but they weren't always in agreement about which rules, right? So they needed procedures, decision-making procedures, to solve their collective action problems and make law, but they didn't agree about which procedures necessarily ought to be adopted. Turns out it's actually fairly easy to solve coordination problems because everybody has the same goal in mind. In particular, it's fairly easy to agree on rules, the consequences of which are indeterminate for each individual party to the rules. It's much easier to agree on those rules than it is to agree on specific policies because everybody has a good idea about what the specific policies how the specific policies will affect them individually. It's actually not that surprising that the American Constitution is chiefly concerned with procedural questions rather than substantive ones. Americans disagree all the time about what policies should be adopted, but they disagree far less on how disagreements should be settled. That is to say, there is little substantive agreement, but there is a fair amount of procedural agreement. Nobody today really contests the idea of a bicameral legislature, right? The idea that there should be a Senate and a House of Representatives. Everybody seems to agree on that. Nobody seems to disagree really that the courts should have a right to review legislation and decide whether it's constitutional or not. That's called judicial review. And everybody agrees to some extent that there should be a division of labor between federal and state governments. So again, it looks like we have some broad agreement on how government should function, just not necessarily on the specific policies that government should adopt. Now, all constitutions, I think, are the product of their time, and Americans love their Constitution, although Americans tend to disagree a little bit about what the Constitution says. That being said, admiring the Constitution should not impair our objective analysis of it. As I said, every constitution is shaped by the problems of its time. For Americans, taxation and representation were really big issues. Liberty is a big hot-button issue, especially during the discussions around the Bill of Rights. If you look at other constitutions, like the French Constitution, they have different obsessions, right? Different things that they're really different things that they're really interested in preventing or interested in making happen. So the French Constitution was obsessed with establishing political equality between the members of the public and their former masters in the nobility and the clergy. So really interested in social equality and creating social equality where there was none. Many constitutions in countries that were once colonized and recently decolonized in the 60s and 70s are really concerned with limiting foreign influence in their domestic affairs. They're very worried about foreign control in their economy and in their political decision-making because that was their history. And so in their constitution, you see a lot of restrictions on foreign ownership and foreign influence. If we had to redesign a constitution today, it's quite likely that we would choose slightly different constitutional rules. Think about the Third Amendment, the prohibition on quartering soldiers in civilian homes during peacetime. I don't think that would make it on the list today. So I'm going to part with a question for you. If we had a constitutional convention today to reform American government, what would you like to see added compared to what we have currently? And perhaps what would you like to see removed?